What were you created for? Growing up, I was so convinced that I was created to be a NFL football player. So convinced that I was going to grow up and be this incredible NFL football player. I was trying to convince my parents of this all the way growing up. And they had these worries and concerns. They were like, Corey, you're going to get injured. You're going to get hurt. That's not what you were created for. But I didn't listen. So in my freshman year, they said, okay, we will let you play high school tackle football. And you know what? When I got hit for the first time, you know what I realized? That's not what I was created for at all. Really quickly learned that's not what I was created for at all. Anyone here ever have an experience like that? Or you're really searching, well, what am I supposed to do with this life? What am I supposed to do with this life? Thinking that we're created for something, and then something happens, maybe you get hit, and then you realize maybe I'm created for something more. I can remember going to college and learning more and more about God and then having this passion and feeling this calling to become a pastor. What was it for you? What's going on in your life? What's your situation? How would you answer this question right here, right now? Whether you're in person or watching online, what were you created for? Today, we're actually going to dive into someone from the Bible, a man named Paul. Paul thought that he was created for one thing, and then when he met Jesus, he quickly realized, well, that's not what I was created for at all. I was created for something much more. Paul actually, he grew up and he wanted to be one of the very best religious leaders of Jesus' time, and he was. He was very serious about keeping what they called the law. And that was all the parts of the Old Testament Bible, our Old Testament Bible that points all the way to Jesus. And he thought that he was created for that life, to the point where he was actually an enemy of the church. The early church, the first followers of Jesus, and that's what we're talking about when we talk about church, is us. All followers of Jesus here together, learning and growing what it's like to be more like Jesus. He was actually an enemy of that church, Paul was. He saw it as a threat, and he was actually on the road. He was traveling to go and bring charges against one of those early church leaders, those first followers of Jesus. And then he had this experience. He saw Jesus, and it changed everything in his life. He went from the church's biggest enemy to its greatest advocate overnight. He started to realize that he needed to learn and to grow more like Jesus, and that wasn't what he was created for. He was created to be in relationship with Jesus. He was created to be in relationship with each other, and that's exactly the same thing that you and I, right here, right now, that's what we're created for as well. He had such a radical change in his life that he went on for the next 30 years of his life, growing and planting churches all across the world. He raised up leaders, taught them what it was like to learn and to grow more like Jesus. And he ended up writing half of our New Testament, the portion of our Bible that is all about Jesus, who he is, what he did with his life and ministry, and then the portion where it talks about the church, what it's like to learn and to grow and to be in relationship with each other. So what was it for you? Did you have an experience that drew you closer to Jesus? Maybe you're like Paul and you're not a follower of Jesus just yet. And you think that you're created for this one thing, this one avenue of life, but you're kind of filled with this brokenness, this feeling of hatred maybe to this other group, a group that thinks differently than you, the bitterness, the anger, the brokenness. If we're designed to be in relationship with each other, how can we do that? How can we do that in the real world when life gets messy? Would you agree? Life gets messy. Relationships get messy. And so that's what we're going to unpack here. We're going to unpack in this series as we finish out our series of Known, of just how God already knows who we are. He already knows your story, well, what you've been through, just like he knew Paul. And he knows that we were created to be in relationship with him. So what we're going to look at is our key verse for this series, Known, that we find in Psalm chapter 139, verse 1, where it says this: "O Lord, you have examined my heart." In church, in person, online, go ahead and read this part with me. "Know everything about me." Know everything about me. He knows everything about us. And he knows what it takes to have healthy relationships with each other and what it's like to grow more like Jesus. And that's the one thing that I want to just dive into and talk with you guys through the rest of our time here. What it's like to grow more like Jesus. And what that's like in our own lives, in our own relationships that we find ourselves in. This is not something that's just done overnight without any effort. This is something that takes time to develop. But what does it mean? What does it mean when we say we're growing more like Jesus? And how do we know when we get there what areas in our life that really is talking about? And if you're not a believer just yet, or first follower of Jesus, and you're thinking about this, maybe you're scared to take that chance because, well, is it going to change everything about who I am? We'll dive more into that. The reality is that a lot of people from the outside, they look at church, us as followers of Jesus gathered together on the outside, and they see the headlines. They see the headlines of the TV and news, and they see that we're supposed to be in relationship with each other, yet we're dividing. Churches all across the world, they're splitting, they're dividing, they're going their separate ways. And they see that from the outside, and they say, what? I thought they were supposed to be different than everyone else. And the tension that we feel is that we have brokenness. We have brokenness in our own lives, in our own relationships. And that comes up, and we see that all around us. And the good thing is that man that we talked about before, Paul was writing to a church out in Ephesus. It was a city called Ephesus, and it was right in where we have our modern day understanding of Turkey. And he was writing to this church that was under extreme pressure. And he had this to say to them. We find this in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 15, where it says this: "Instead, we will speak the truth in love." In church, in person, online, go ahead and say this part with me. "Growing in every way more and more like Christ, who is the head of his body, the church." Growing more and more like Christ. And so Paul, he was writing to this church. This church had a culture surrounding them that was putting a lot of different pressure on them. The culture that surrounded this church that he was writing to in Ephesus, it had this culture that said, hey, we glorify things like conflicts, disagreements. We thrive on that. It celebrated things like divisions and separations. What was remarkable about this letter, this church out in Ephesus, is that this church was under this intense pressure with disagreements, with conflicts, to just give up, to just walk away. Yet, somehow, they stayed united. And what Paul is saying here is it's a letter of encouragement. What he's saying is what you're doing is working. Continue on. Protect that. Protect your community. But is it any different for us today? Don't we live in a culture that is always telling us if someone disagrees with you, it's just walk away. Even in the church, it's splitting. And God, it breaks his heart. It was supposed to be different. It was supposed to be a place of peace, of community, be bound together with our common commitment for Jesus. So what was so special about this church? The one that we see that was able to withstand those pressures, able to be united when everyone else was saying, well, if you've got a conflict, well, just give up, just walk away. How did they survive? So with the rest of our time here, I want to unpack 3 actions that we can take, 3 things that we can do as followers of Jesus, as we're learning what it's like to grow more like Jesus, that we can do in our own lives, in our own real relationships to seek unity. The first one that we're going to do comes straight from this letter. As we're growing more like Jesus, the first action we need to take is we need to make allowance for each other's faults. Make allowance for each other's faults. And before we dive deeper into that, I want you guys to take out this card. If you are in here and you were given a card while you walked in, I want you to take that out. If you don't already have one of these and you want one, go ahead and raise your hand and our ushers can get that to you. But I want you to take this out and I want you to look at it. And as we go through the rest of our time here, I want you to think about a real relationship you have in your life, a real person, a real situation, something that there's a division between you now. Maybe it was a conflict with maybe a sibling, coworker, maybe just a fellow follower of Jesus that you just didn't see eye to eye with. Someone in your real life. And I want you to write down their name on this card. And as we continue to talk and unpack for the rest of our time here, I want you to think about the situation. Think about what was it that caused that division, the disunity between you and them. This can be something that happened long ago or something that happened more recently. But go ahead and take that card out and write a person's name down on it. So, our first action that we need to take is we need to make allowance for each other's faults. And this really comes from this verse in that letter. This is the first portion that we get to before the one that we just read. But this is Paul, and he's writing to this church out in Ephesus, and he says this, always be, what church? Humble and gentle, be patient with each other, and then go ahead and read this last part with me. Making allowance for each other's faults because of your love. Because of your love. And I know what you're thinking right here, because that's exactly what I was thinking when I first read this. Make allowance for each other's faults? That's unity? That just sounds like he's saying unity is you get to just be walked all over. Who else reads it like that? Is that true unity? Just saying like, okay, whatever happened, it hurt me. I just have to sweep it under the rug and act like nothing happened. Well, that's not what he's saying here. Actually, the original word here for make allowance, another way to define it is to lift up. And what he's saying here is that it's far too easy. It's far too easy when we have conflicts with each other, when we have disagreements, when we don't see eye to eye or things are said or I assume the worst in you, it's far too easy to tear each other down. What he's saying is when that happens, we have to lift each other up. We can't just tear each other down. So unity here, growing more like Jesus in all of these areas builds unity in our relationships. Unity doesn't mean that we have to be someone's punching bag or doormat to get walked all over. Really what he's saying here is that this is about our hearts. This is about our perspective, how we view each other. And we're not enemies. What he's saying is that these areas, humbleness, gentleness, making allowance for each other's faults or lifting each other up rather than tearing down, and loving one another, these are attitudes that we must grow more like Jesus in. And these are essential for unity. If they're not there, then we're not going to have really healthy relationships with one another. We're not growing more like Jesus. In this society, they glorified things like independence, separation, division, conflicts. So when it comes to humbleness, this was something radical that Paul is saying, something very countercultural, where you say, and I'm going to be humble in this moment. And I'm realizing that I need others. I need Jesus. I was created to be in relationship with him, but also to be in relationship with others. So humility in this context, this is really, think about it like compassion. It's seeing others and seeing their needs, seeing that they may have a different perspective than you and not just understand your own. So that's exactly what he's saying here. This is an attitude that we need to grow more like Jesus in. And then gentleness. Gentleness is often kind of seen as weakness in our society, just like it would have been theirs. It would have been something that they would have valued strength, domineering behavior, bending people to your will, stepping all over them. And what he's saying right here is that we need to grow more like Jesus. We need to be gentle. We need to have a self-control that we can listen first before we react and discern injustice where it's at. And then love is a sacrifice. It's not an emotion. It's a choice that we get to make because we might not get anything in return. It's not transactional. And my mentor, as I was growing up, he had a clever saying that he would say over and over again that I really think just sums up this whole action that we're called to take. And he had this to say: we judge others by their actions and ourselves by our intentions. Right? Kind of strikes you at the core. We judge others by their actions and ourselves by our intentions. And I'll give you an example about this. One time that it really hit me. I'm like, you know what? I'm a kind, caring, compassionate person. You know, this applies to everyone else, but probably not me. But when I got in my first car accident, and I was living out in Seattle, I got sideswiped. Someone just went into my lane. They didn't see me. We pull over to exchange information. And the first thing that they did when they got out of the car was they said, "Oh my goodness, I am so sorry. I didn't see you there. I didn't mean to hit you." And I didn't say this out loud, but in my mind, I was like, yeah, but you did. You did hit me. What was I doing there? I only cared about what happened, what affected me, their actions. I could care less about their heart. I could care less about what was going on in their day. What was the meaning behind it? How do you want to be judged? How do you want to be judged by others? And how do you want to be judged by God solely on what we do externally? Or do you think having some intention behind understanding people's motives, really seeing their perspective, would you rather be judged that way? Because the reality is if I caused that accident, I really would care about if I meant to do it or not. Think about that person. Think about that person's name that you wrote on that card. What was the situation? What actually happened? Do you know their perspective? And I know what you're thinking right now. Corey, you don't know what happened. You don't know what they did to me. You don't know what they said to me. You don't know how bad they hurt me. Trust me, I live in the same fallen and broken world as you do. I get it. And I get it because I've lived it. I'm still learning and growing more like Jesus in this. This is what we're called to do. We're called to learn and to grow more like Jesus. And it's not just going to happen randomly. We're going to have to make it happen. The problem is that when we get to this, when we get to our conflicts, when we get to our differences, whatever they are, whether they're big or small, for us, our human nature, our society, our culture, they tell us, it's just easier to leave. It's easier to walk away than to figure out that other person's heart, to change our lens, to view each other the way that Jesus would view them. And it really leads me to this second action that we're called to take. And it is that we have to bind ourselves together with peace. Church, go ahead and repeat that with me. Bind yourself together with peace. And we get this in the following verse of the same letter, that he's telling them this is what you need to do to protect what you already have, the unity that you have as a church. And we find this in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 3, where it says this: make every effort to keep yourselves what? United in the Spirit. And then go ahead and read this part with me. Binding yourselves together with peace. Make every effort to keep yourselves united. And that means that we have to prioritize. We have to prioritize things like unity, harmony, and not celebrate things like differences or conflicts. And it's not easy. And I think the mistake that many of us make is that we assume that this church that he's writing to, that got it right, that they must have just dressed the same, right? All acted the same, had gone to high school, and that's really what unity is when we all vote the same way. Don't make that mistake. This church was actually made up of two of the most radical, polar opposite groups that you could imagine in Jesus' time. It was made up of the Jews and the Gentiles. And the Jews, they had this tradition, they had this understanding of what the Old Testament, our portion of the Bible that points the way to Jesus, they had a tradition around it. And many, many years. And then the Gentiles, they were seen as outsiders. They're seen as someone to be outcast, and they were not part of that tradition. And yet, when they were united in the Spirit, not in their earthly categories, they were able to have unity. They were able to be a unified church with the culture saying that it's just separate. If that person doesn't agree with you, just leave. Yet they weren't able to see each other as enemies. Because this is what Paul had to say later on as a reminder to them in this same letter. In Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12, it has this to say: for we are not fighting against what, church? Flesh and blood enemies, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world. We are not fighting against flesh and blood enemies. He's saying that person that is written down on that card, their name, who they are, they're not your real enemy. Church was supposed to be different, right? It was not designed to be seen as a war zone, as a battleground, as a place that we need to defend ourselves and then take up arms against that person sitting right next to you. What he's saying is that remember, in order to have unity, we need to know who our true enemy is, and it's not that person written on that paper. Because when we start to do that, when we start to feed into that lie, to view each other as enemies, casualties happen. People's faith is forever harmed. They're scarred, and they end up walking away from God. And what he's saying is we need to bind ourselves together with peace. Bind ourselves together with peace. And this is not just a side effect. It doesn't randomly happen. There is unity found in our common commitment to Jesus. Anyone here ever try to bind something together? Maybe tie something together? If you were to bind a book together, you have all the pages in order, right? You put it on a table, and then you have some string or some rope, and then you just throw it down on there, and randomly it gets bound. That's not usually how that works, is it? It has to have some effort, some intention behind it. You have to know what you're doing. That's the same thing that he's saying as we're growing more like Jesus, as we're seeking unity in our relationships. When life gets messy, when we can't tear each other down, and learning to lift each other up, it's not going to be easy. It's not going to happen unless we try, unless we put in the action. And what he says is that you have to protect that community. Because really what's at stake here is that if we don't live into this, if you say, walk away here and say, you know what, that's for someone else, then you'll really be vulnerable, spiritually immature. You might be vulnerable to those attacks the temptations, and live in kind of that way that Paul lived before knowing Jesus. Just trying to persecute, trying to accuse, all the while just feeling really hurt and broken inside. You were created for much more than that. You were created to be in relationship with Jesus and also in relationship with each other. And it just brings me to the last action that we have to do, because all of you have an important part to play. So as we make allowance for each other's faults, we bind ourselves together with peace. What we have to do is our part. Go ahead and repeat that with me, church. Do your part. Do your part. We all have a part. You right now have a part to play that only you can do. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 16 says this: He makes the whole body fit perfectly together. And he's talking about God there. As each, and go ahead and read this highlighted part with me, does its own special work. Each part does its own special work. It helps the other parts grow so that the whole body is healthy and growing and full of love. You have an important part to play. You have an important part to play that only you can play. We have to do this. Unity, what we talked about before, it's not agreeing on everything, agreeing on these earthly categories that divide us. It's found in our common commitment to Jesus. And if you don't know where to start, if you're looking at that piece of paper, the name on that piece of paper, remembering the situation that happened, why don't we start? Start by praying like Jesus. Because as we're learning to grow more like Jesus, praying like Jesus can help us to understand where his heart is, how he viewed each and every one of us. I found the prayer that Jesus prayed about 24 hours before he was going to be put to death really interesting. Think about this. With some of your last moments, if you knew you were going to die in 24 hours, what would you pray to God for? Because this is what Jesus prayed to God for. He said, I pray that they, and he's talking about all followers, all churches, both then and now, will be one, just as you and I are one. With some of his final moments here on earth, right before being crucified, his whole concern was not himself, but you and I, and that we would be one, that we would be united. Isn't that incredible? Because he knew that if we, all of the churches around the entire world, we're not caught up in these earthly categories, but found our common commitment in Jesus, we would be unstoppable. It'd be the greatest testimony of all time. And in order for us to do that, you have to do your part. You have to do your part. So as you go into your week, I challenge you to take this next step, to pray for one person, that person that you wrote down on that card. Maybe you have a strained relationship with them. I want you to go ahead and pray for them and spend time with them just to understand their perspective. It's going to take time and development. And actually something that we do here at Alive Church is every Monday, me and the elders, we pray over all of the connection cards, all of the prayer requests. And if you don't know where to start, if you're holding that card, join us in prayer. On Mondays at 4, we pray over all of those connection cards. If you want to join us at that time, wherever you're at, if you're at work or you are doing chores or at home, at that time, just join us. Pray to God. Seek his guidance. Imagine not seeing church as a battleground. If you're going to take that step, go ahead and indicate that on the connection card, in person, online, because we would love to pray with you. We would love to help you through that situation, whatever is going on. Because imagine this. Imagine seeing one global, united religion, belief in Jesus. And when I said that word there, religion, what comes to your mind? For many of us, it's kind of a dirty word. It's been hijacked by some of the controversies over time, some of the divisions, the hurt of God's global body. But it's not how that word was intended. Religion was actually an incredibly beautiful word that was crafted because the first church, the first followers of Jesus, they looked at this same exact passage that you and I just looked at today. They said, do we even have a word for that? What is a word that could encapsulate what that church had? Their ability to stay united when the culture just says, get up and leave. What do you even call that? So the early church, they had a Latin word for that, and that's where we get our word religion today, and it means to bind. Religion, when we talk about it, what we're talking about it is the thing that binds us all together. And that's our common commitment to Jesus. That's what religion is, finding unity in the Spirit. And another definition of that same word was ligament. They looked at that same passage and they said, if all of us are part of the same body, we have an important part to play. We need to be bound together in some way. Because imagine this, imagine trying to stand up right now out of the seat that you're in without any ligaments. It's not gonna happen, is it? You need to be bound together, sewn together with peace. So what he's saying here is that religion, our common commitment to Jesus, that's what binds us together. That's what causes us to get out of here and to move as a church in this community and in this world. And if not, then we're just a disabled, divided church body. So how are you going to grow more like Jesus today? Imagine not seeing that person written down on that card as your enemy. What areas do you need to grow in? Take out that piece of paper, carry it with you. Make sure that you see it throughout this week. I'm not alone in this, but I know that I've seen what happens when we have a paralyzed, divided church body. I've seen people leave and give up on God. I've seen the hurt and the pain, and I also carry the scars of it happening to me. Damage of a divided church body, the hurt and brokenness when we stop growing more like Jesus. I've seen it firsthand. It's one of the most painful experiences of my life, and it broke my heart, and I know it breaks Jesus's too. Your true enemy is not of flesh and blood. It's not that person on that piece of paper. We have to bind ourselves because of our common commitment to Jesus, to each other. So how will you go out of this building and seek unity, and grow more like Jesus? Go ahead and pray with me, church. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for who you are, for giving us the roadmap to unity, to healthy restoration in all of our relationships. Lord, help us to grow more like Jesus. We're so grateful that we got to celebrate baby Hunter. And just the fact that this church is learning and growing more like Jesus and making that a priority in Hunter's life. Thank you, Lord, that you've given us this roadmap and the ability for us to learn what it takes to be unified when everyone else says, hey, it's easier to give up, to walk away. For those who are taking this next step, I pray for them. I pray for their situation. I pray for boldness, for encouragement, and that you guide them and strengthen them as they seek out unity, understanding that other perspective. Lord, and I want to pray for maybe someone who's made the decision to follow you for the first time today. If that's you, go ahead and pray this prayer with me. Dear Lord, I want to make you the leader of my life. Lord, lift me up and help me to lift up others around me. Take away the guilt and the shame of my past and help me to grow more like Jesus. In your name we pray. Amen.